The rain in Manhattan did not wash the grease from the gutters. It just made the oil slick and shiny under the yellow street lamps. Clara adjusted the strap of her canvas backpack, feeling the coarse weight of her father's brass pocket watch pressing against her collarbone through her faded denim jacket. She stood across the street from Avenue Montaigne, the city's most exclusive luxury boutique, watching the private security guards through the glass. Her hands were raw, chapped at the knuckles from hours of unheated training in the old Queen's boxing gym, a sharp contrast to the pristine marble-floored world across the asphalt. She took a deep breath, stepping out into the cold drizzle, her worn boots splashing through a puddle of dark water. Inside the boutique, the air smelled faintly of expensive jasmine and white sage. The floor manager, a man named Sterling, whose tailored suit cost more than Clara's annual rent, watched her entrance with immediate, calculated disdain. He did not see a customer. He saw a statistical anomaly that needed to be monitored or removed. Clara walked slowly, her eyes tracking the security camera blind spots, her body moving with a fluid, liquid grace that came from 15 years of traditional martial arts mastery. She wasn't just walking, she was measuring distances, analyzing exit routes, and calculating the exact weight of the air in the room. She approached the center glass case, where the Paragon diamond sat beneath a specialized halogen beam. It was a $20 million stone, flawless, cut like a frozen teardrop and guarded by an independent biometric lock system. To Sterling, she looked like a wandering tourist out of her depth, her fingers lingering too close to the glass. To the man watching through the security feed 3 miles away, she was a ghost breaking a very specific rule. Clara leaned in closer, letting her breath fog the glass slightly before wiping it away with a frayed sleeve. Sterling stepped forward, his voice a calculated venom of high-end hospitality. "Can I help you find something specific, miss, or are you just looking for a dry place to stand?" Clara did not look up from the diamond. "It's heavy," she murmured, her voice flat, carrying the exhaustion of a year spent chasing ghosts. "The cut is slightly off on the southern facet. Whoever polished this was in a hurry." Sterling let out a short, aristocratic laugh, gesturing subtly to a nearby security guard. "I assure you the Paragon was handled by the finest gemologists in Amsterdam. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our silver collection near the rear exit." Clara smiled, a tiny, sad movement of her lips that never reached her eyes. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, scratched brass wrench, a tool her father had used to fix sewing machines before they took everything from him, and casually dropped it onto the glass case. The sharp clink of metal against treated glass shattered the quiet luxury of the room. As Sterling flinched, Clara's hand moved at an invisible, terrifying speed, a blurred strike that bypassed the biometric sensor completely by shorting the low-voltage wire beneath the display trim with a pin she'd slipped from her cuff. The glass top popped open with a soft hiss of released pneumatic pressure. Before the guard could draw his baton, Clara's fingers closed around the $20 million ring. She did not run. Instead, she turned directly toward the main security camera, held the diamond up to the light, and let out a long, deliberate breath. "Put it down," the guard shouted, his hand trembling as he drew his taser. "Don't move a single step." Sterling's face turned an ash-gray color. "You stupid girl, you've ruined your life. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Clara kept her eyes on the camera lens, knowing exactly who was watching the live feed. "Tell Marcus that Marcus Sr.'s daughter has his favorite toy," she said softly, her voice steady despite the red taser dots settling on her chest. "Tell him I'll be waiting at the old foundry on 3rd. The guard fired. The 2 prongs shot through the air, trailing copper wire, aiming directly for Clara's center mass. To an ordinary observer, the deployment was instantaneous. To Clara, whose nervous system had been forged through decades of split-second counterstrikes, the wires moved like reeds in a slow river. She twisted her torso by a fraction of an inch, letting the prongs catch only the loose fabric of her oversized jacket, then snatched the wires mid-air, ripping the taser from the guard's grip with a single sudden jerk of her wrist. The heavy plastic device shattered against the marble floor. Sterling gasped, stumbling backward into a rack of silk scarves. "What are you?" "Just a thief," Clara said, slipping the diamond into her pocket alongside her father's watch. "Call the police. Make sure it's loud." She didn't leave through the back. She walked out the front doors, the alarm system screaming behind her, into the cold New York rain. The old iron foundry on 3rd Avenue smelled of wet soot and forgotten labor. Rain leaked through the corrugated tin roof, dropping steadily into rusted iron buckets with a rhythmic metallic thud. Clara sat on a wooden crate in the center of the vast hollow space, her hands wrapped in cheap cotton training tape. The $20 million ring sat on a rusted oil drum beside a cold cup of coffee she had bought from a cart 2 hours ago. The coffee had a thin film of oil floating on top, reflecting the dim red glow of a distant exit sign. She pulled her father's brass watch from her neck, clicking the latch open. The glass face was cracked across the center, a permanent scar from the night Marcus's men had broken into their home, demanding the ledger her father had kept. Her father hadn't been a fighter. He had been a quiet clerk who discovered where the syndicate buried their money. They had beaten him until his hands could no longer hold a pen, then left him to die in a cold apartment while the police ruled it a simple robbery. The heavy steel doors of the foundry groaned open, cutting through the sound of the rain. 4 men entered, their silhouettes long and sharp against the wet streetlights outside. They moved with the professional coordination of military contractors, their heavy coats unbuttoned to allow quick access to the holstered firearms beneath. In the center of the group walked Marcus, a man whose tailored suits matched Sterling's but whose eyes held the dead, flat coldness of an apex predator. He didn't look angry, he looked profoundly bored. Marcus stopped 10 feet away, his leather shoes crunching on the grit and rust covering the concrete floor. He looked at the oil drum, then at the ring, and finally at Clara's bruised knuckles. "You went to a lot of trouble for a piece of charcoal, girl," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that echoed in the empty rafters. "Your father didn't know when to mind his business either. Look where that got him." "He's dead," Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of total stillness, "and you're still breathing. I found that mathematical equation unsatisfactory." Marcus smiled, a hollow gesture that showed white, perfect teeth. "You think because you can dodge a mall guard's taser you're something special? You're 20 years old, you're a child living in a fantasy world." He nodded to the largest man on his left, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Victor, who had spent a decade in underground Russian fighting rings. "Get the ring, break her legs if she makes a sound." Victor stepped forward, his massive boots making no sound on the concrete, a true professional. He didn't rush. He approached Clara with a casual, heavy confidence, reaching out a massive, scarred hand toward her collarbone to pin her down. Clara didn't shift her weight. She waited until Victor's fingers were 2 inches from her skin, then her hand snapped upward like a striking viper. Her palm struck the underside of Victor's wrist, deflecting his reach, while her left elbow drove directly into the soft tissue of his armpit, collapsing his lung with a heavy concussive thud. Before Victor could register the pain, Clara pivoted on her heel, her hip catching his center of gravity, and used his own forward momentum to hurl the 250-pound man directly into the rusted oil drum. The drum buckled with a loud ringing boom, spilling the cold coffee across the floor. Victor lay there, gasping for air, his ribs cracked, unable to find his feet. The remaining 2 guards immediately reached under their coats for their sidearms. Clara didn't give them the distance. She exploded forward, a blur of motion through the dim light. She closed the 10-foot gap in 2 steps, her boots slipping through the spilled coffee without losing balance. She struck the first guard's throat with the ridge of her hand, silencing his breath, then seized his wrist, forcing his drawn pistol upward just as the second guard fired. The gunshot exploded through the foundry, the bullet burying itself in the wooden roof. Clara twisted the first guard's arm, using his body as a shield as she drove a fierce, descending heel kick into the second guard's knee. The joint snapped with a wet, sickening crack. The man collapsed, his gun skidding across the concrete into the darkness. Clara released the first guard, who crumpled to the floor, clutching his throat and gasping for breath. Total silence returned to the foundry, save for the steady drip of rainwater against tin. Marcus hadn't moved. His hand remained inside his coat, his fingers wrapped around a small silver-plated revolver, but his face had completely changed. The boredom was gone, replaced by a cold, sweating realization. He looked at his 3 best men writhing on the floor in under 8 seconds. "Who taught you that?" Marcus whispered, his voice losing its aristocratic edge. "Your father was a mouse." "My father was a good man," Clara said, walking toward him slowly, her breathing even, her heart rate perfectly controlled. "But my grandfather was a master of the old ways in Huizhou. He taught me that the loudest men are always the hollowest." Marcus pulled the revolver, aiming it directly between her eyes. "I'll blow your brains across this floor." Clara stopped 5 feet away. "Fire it." Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. His knuckles turned white. But he couldn't pull it. Looking into Clara's eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw an absolute, terrifying readiness for death. A person who doesn't fear dying cannot be controlled by a gun. "You think you won?" Marcus hissed, his hand beginning to shake. "Even if you kill me, my people have the city wired." That ring was the collateral for a $50 million shipment coming through the harbor tonight. "You've just started a war you can't win." "I know," Clara said softly. "That's why I left the boutique's security feed open, and that's why I brought this." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out not a weapon but a small black digital recorder. The red light was blinking. It had been recording since the moment Marcus entered the building. "The NYPD Harbor Patrol is already at Pier 42, Clara said, her voice completely devoid of triumph, carrying only a heavy, final weariness. "They don't care about a $20 million ring as much as they care about the $50 million in federal contraband you just admitted to on tape." In the distance, past the sound of the falling rain, the faint, rising wail of police sirens began to echo through the Manhattan streets. Marcus looked at the recorder, then down at his fallen men, and finally at the small brass watch hanging around Clara's neck. His empire, built on decades of quiet terror, had just been dismantled by a 20-year-old girl with dirt on her boots and a broken heart. "You're a monster," Marcus whispered. "No," Clara said, picking the diamond ring up from the wet floor and dropping it into his shaking hand. "I'm just my father's daughter. Keep the ring. You'll need it for bail." She turned her back on him, completely exposed, and walked toward the exit. Marcus raised the gun, his teeth bared in a silent scream of rage, but his legs failed him. He sank down onto a rusted crate as the red and blue lights of the first police cruisers began to flash through the cracked windows of the foundry. The rain stopped just before dawn. Clara walked into her small, one-room apartment in Queens. The radiator was clinking loudly, throwing off a dry metallic heat that did nothing to warm the dampness in her bones. She took off her wet denim jacket, hanging it carefully over the back of a wooden chair, and placed her father's brass pocket watch on the kitchen table. She walked over to the small counter, poured the remainder of yesterday's stale coffee into a mug, and sat down. Her knuckles were bruised and raw, the cotton tape stained with grease and a small drop of dark blood. She didn't feel happy. She didn't feel the rush of revenge. She just felt the quiet, immense weight of an old debt finally paid. She clicked the brass watch open one last time. The cracked glass reflected the pale gray light of the New York morning, breaking through her small window. "It's done, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. She took a sip of the cold coffee, closed her eyes, and let her breath out slowly into the quiet house.